All right, Shepherd, here we go with another chapter in Inca Gold. We are now on chapter 5. Let's see, what had happened before? Oh, that's right, chapter 4. He got out of the pit and went into the jungle. Soaked by a constant drizzle, the prisoners were herded through a moss blanketed forest until the trail ended at a deep ravine. Their captors drove them across a fallen log that served as a bridge to the other side, where they followed the remains of an ancient stone road that wound up the mountains. The leader of the terrorist band set a fast pace, and Doc Miller was particularly hard pressed to keep up. His clothes were wet, and it was impossible to tell where the sweat left off and the damp from the rain began. The guards prodded him unmercifully with the muzzles of their guns whenever he dropped behind. Giordino stepped beside the old man, propped one of Miller's arms over his shoulder, and helped him along, seeming oblivious to the pummeling provided by the sadistic guards against his defenseless back and shoulders. "Keep that gun off him," Shannon snapped at the bandit in Spanish. She took Miller's other arm and hung it around her neck so that both she and Giordino could support the older man. The bandit replied by kicking her viciously. She staggered forward, gray-faced, her lips tight in pain, but she regained her balance and gave the bandit a withering stare. Giordino found himself smiling at Shannon, wondering at her spirit and guts and untiring strength. She still had on her swimsuit under a sleeveless cotton blouse. The guerrillas had allowed her to retrieve her from her tent, along with a pair of hiking boots. He was also conscious of an overwhelming sense of ineffectiveness, in his inability to save this woman from harm and degradation. And there was also a feeling of cowardice for deserting his old friend without a fight. He'd thought of snatching a guard's gun at least 20 times since, but that would only have gotten him killed and solved nothing. As long as he somehow stayed alive, there was a chance. Giordino cursed each step that he took, taking him further and further away from saving Pitt. For hours they fought for breath in the thin Andes air as they struggled to an altitude of 11,000 feet. Everyone suffered from the cold. Although it soared under a blazing sun during the day, the temperature dropped to near freezing in the early hours of morning. Dawn found them still ascending along an ancient avenue of ruined white limestone buildings, high walls, and agricultural terraced hills that Shannon never dreamed existed. None of the structures looked as though they were built to the same specifications. Some were oval, some circular, very few were rectangular. They appeared oddly different from the other ancient structures she had studied. Was this all part of the Chacapoya Confederation, she wondered, or another kingdom, another society? As the stone road followed along raised walls that reached almost into the mists rolling in from the mountain peaks above, she was astounded by the thousands of stone carvings of very different ornamentation than she had ever seen. Great dragon-like birds and serpent-shaped fish mingled with stylized panthers and monkeys. The chiseled reliefs seemed oddly similar to Egyptian hieroglyphics, except that they were more abstract. That unknown ancient peoples had inhabited the great plateau and ridges of the Peruvian Andes and constructed cities of such immense portions came as a thrilling surprise to Shannon. She had not expected to find a culture so architecturally advanced that it erected structures on top of mountains as elaborate or extensive as any of the known ancient world. She would have given the Dodge Viper that she bought with her grandfather's inheritance to have lingered long enough to study these extraordinary ruins, but whenever she paused, she was roughly shoved forward. The sun was showing when the bedraggled party emerged from a narrow pass into a small valley, with mountains soaring on all sides. Though the rain thankfully had stopped, they all looked like rats who had barely escaped drowning. They saw ahead a lofty stone block building, rising a good 12 stories high. Unlike the Mayan pyramids of Mexico, this structure had a rounder, more conical shape that was cut off at the top. It had ornate heads of animals and birds carved into the walls. Shannon recognized it as a ceremonial temple. The rear of the structure merged into a steep sandstone cliff, honeycombed with thousands of burial caves, all with ornate exterior doorways facing onto a sheer drop. An edifice on the top of the building, flanked with two large sculptures of a feathered jaguar with wings. She tentatively identified as a palace of the death gods. It was sitting in a small city with over 100 buildings, painstakingly constructed and lavishly decorated. The variety of architecture was astonishing. Some structures were built on top of high towers, surrounded by graceful balconies. Most were completely circular, while others sat on rectangular bases. Shannon was speechless. For a few moments, the immensity of the sight overwhelmed her. The identity of the great complex of structures became immediately apparent. If what she saw before her was to be believed, the Shining Path terrorists had discovered an incredible lost city, one that archaeologists, herself included, doubted existed, that treasure seekers had searched for but never found through 4 centuries of exploration. The lost city of the dead, whose mythical riches went beyond those in the Valley of the Kings in ancient Egypt. Shannon gripped Rogers tightly about one arm. The lost Pueblo de los Muertes, she whispered. The lost what? He asked blankly. No talking, snapped one of the terrorists, jamming the butt of his automatic rifle in Rogers' side, just above the kidneys. Rogers gave a stifled gasp, and he staggered and almost went down, but Shannon bravely held him on his feet, tensed for a blow that mercifully never came to hurt. After a short walk over a broad stone street, they approached the circular structure that towered over the surrounding ceremonial complex, like a Gothic cathedral over a medieval city. They toiled up several flights of an extraordinary switchback stairway, decorated mosaics of winged humans set in stone, designs Shannon had never seen before. On the upper landing, beyond a great arched entrance, they entered a high-ceilinged room with geometric motifs cut into the stone walls. The center of the floor was crammed with intricately carved stone sculptures of every size and description. Ceramic effigy jars and elegant, ornately painted vessels were stacked in chambers leading off the main room. One of the chambers was piled high with beautifully preserved textiles in every imaginable design and color. Textiles would be like rugs or wall hangings, tapestries. The archaeologists were stunned to see such an extensive cache of artifacts. To them, it was like entering King Tut's tomb in Egypt's Valley of the Kings before the treasures were removed by famed archaeologist Howard Carter and put on display in the National Museum in Cairo. There was little time to study the treasure trove of artifacts. The terrorists quickly led the Peruvian students down an interior stairway and imprisoned them in a cell deep beneath the upper temple. Giordino and the rest were roughly thrown into a side room and guarded by 2 surly rebels who eyed them like exterminators contemplating a spider's nest. Everyone except Giordino sank gracefully to the hard, cold floor, fatigue etched in their faces. Giordino pounded his fist against the stone wall in frustration. During the forced march, he had watched intently for a chance to fade into the jungle and make his way back to the sinkhole. But with at least 3 guards taking turns training their automatic weapons at his back with cold steadiness, the entire trip, the opportunity for escape, never materialized. He didn't need any convincing that they were old hands at rounding up hostages and driving them through rugged terrain. Any hope of reaching Pitt now was slim indeed. During the march, he had smothered his characteristic defiance and acted meek and subjected. Except for a dowdy display of concern for Doc Miller, he did nothing to invite a torrent of bullets to the gut. He had to stay alive. In his mind, if he died, Pitt died. If Giordino had the slightest notion that Pitt had climbed out of the sinkhole and was pounding over the old stone trail only 30 minutes behind, then he might have felt the urge to attend church at his earliest opportunity. Or at the very least, he might have given the idea brief consideration. With the flashlight carefully hooded to prevent being seen by the terrorists, and its beam angled down at the indentations in the composite covering the soft earth that traveled into the darkness, Pitt plunged through the rainforest. He ignored the rain. He moved with the determination of a man outside of himself. Time meant nothing. Not once did he glance at the luminous dial of his watch. The trek through the rainforest in the dead of night became a blur in his mind. Only when the morning sky began to brighten and he could put away the flashlight did his spirits take a turn for the better. When he began his pursuit, the terrorists had had more than a 3-hour start. But he had closed the gap, walking at a steady gait when the trail ran steeply upward, jogging on the rare stretches where it leveled briefly. He never broke his stride, never once stopped to rest. His heart was beginning to pound under the strain, but his legs still pumped away without any muscle pain or tightness. When he came on the ancient stone road and the going became easier, he actually increased his pace. Thoughts of the unseen horrors of the jungle had been cast aside, and throughout that seemingly perpetual night, all fear and apprehension became strangely remote. He paid scant notice to the immense stone structures along the way. He rushed on, now in daylight and in open ground, making little or no attempt at concealment. Only when he reached the pass into the valley did he slow down and stop. Surveying the landscape ahead, he spotted the huge temple against the steep cliff, approximately a third of a mile away. I'm gonna sneeze. Achoo! One tiny figure sat at the top of the long stairway, hunched over with his back against a wide archway. There was no doubt in Pitt's mind this was where the terrorists had taken the hostages. The narrow pass was the only way in and out of the steep-walled valley. The fear and anxiety that he might stumble across the bodies of Girodino and the archaeologists were swept away in a wave of relief. The hunt was ended. Now the quarry, who did not yet know they were quarry, had to be quietly canceled out one by one until the odds became manageable. He moved in closer. Using the fallen walls of old residential homes around the temple as cover, he crouched and ran soundlessly from one shelter to the next until he crawled behind a large stone figure displaying a phallic design. He paused and stared up at the entrance to the temple. The long stairway leading to the entrance presented a formidable obstacle. Unless he somehow possessed the power of invisibility, Pitt would be shot down before he was a quarter of the way up the steps. Any attempt in broad daylight was suicidal. No way in, he thought bitterly. Flanking the staircase was out of the question. The temple's side walls were too sheer and too smooth. The stones were laid with such precision a knife blade could not fit between the cracks. Then Providence laid a benevolent hand on his shoulder. The problem of creeping up the stairs unseen was erased when Pitt observed that the terrorist who was guarding the entrance to the temple had fallen hard asleep from the effects of the exhausting march through the jungle mountains. Inhaling and exhaling a deep breath, Pitt stealthily crept toward the stairway. Tupac Amaru was a smooth but dangerous character, and he looked it. Having taken the name of the last king of the Incas to be tortured and killed by the Spanish, he was short, narrow-shouldered, and with a vacant brown face, devoid of expression. He looked as though he never learned how to express the least hint of compassion. Unlike most of the hill country people, whose broad faces were smooth and hairless, Amaru wore a huge mustache and long sideburns that stretched from a thick mass of straight hair that was as black as his empty eyes. When the narrow, bloodless lips arched in a slight smile, which was rare, they revealed a set of teeth that would make an orthodontist proud. His men, conversely, often grinned diabolically through jagged and uneven coca-stained bicuspids, but his were beautiful. Amaru had cut a swath of death and destruction throughout the jungle hill country of Amazonias, a department in northeastern Peru that had more than its share of poverty, terrorism, sickness, and bureaucratic corruption. His band of cutthroats was responsible for the disappearance of several explorers, government archaeologists, and army patrols that had entered the region and were never seen again. He was not the revolutionary he seemed. Amaru couldn't have cared less about revolution or improving the lot of the abysmally poor Indians of the Peruvian hinterlands, most of whom worked tiny plots to eke out a bare existence. Amaru had other reasons for controlling the region and keeping the superstitious natives under his domination. He stood in the doorway of the chamber, staring stonily at the three men and one woman before him, as if for the first time relishing the defeat in their eyes, the weariness in their bodies, exactly where he wanted them. "I regret the inconvenience," he said, speaking for the first time since the abduction. "It is good that you offered no resistance, or you would have surely been shot." "You speak pretty good English for a Highlands guerrilla," Rogers acknowledged. "Mr. Tupac Amaru. I attend the University of Texas at Austin." "What hath Texas wrought?" Giardini mumbled under his breath. "Why have you kidnapped us?" Shannon whispered in a voice hushed with fear and fatigue. "For ransom. What else?" replied Amaru. "The Peruvian government will pay well for the return of such respected American scientists, not to mention their brilliant archaeology students, many of whom have rich and respected parents. The money will help us continue our fight against repression of the masses." "Spoken like a communist milking a dead cow," muttered Giordino. "The old Russian version may well be history, but the philosophy of Mao Zedong lives on," Amaru explained patiently. "That is a Chinese communist, Mao Zedong." "It lives on, all right," Doc Miller sneered. "Billions of dollars in economic damage, 26,000 Peruvians dead, most of the victims the very peasants whose rights you claim to be fighting for." His words were cut off by a rifle butt that jammed into the lower back near the kidney. Miller sagged to the stone floor like a bag of potatoes, his face twisted in pain. "You're hardly in a position to question my dedication to the communism cause," Amaru said coldly. Giordino knelt beside the old man and cradled his head. He looked up at the terrorist leader with scorn. "You don't take criticism very well." Giordino was prepared to ward off a blow to his exposed head, but before the guard could raise his rifle butt again, Shannon stepped between them. She glared at Amaru, the pale fear in her face replaced with red anger. "You're a fraud," Shannon stated firmly. Amaru looked at her with a bemused expression. "And what brings you to that curious conclusion, Dr. Kelsey?" "You know my name?" "My agent in the United States alerted me of your latest project to explore the mountains before you and your friends left the airport in Phoenix, Arizona." "Informant, you mean?" "Semantics." "A fraud and a charlatan," Shannon continued. "You and your men aren't shining path revolutionaries. Far from it. You've nothing more than huaqueros, thieving tomb robbers." "She's right," Rogers said, backing her up. "You wouldn't have time to chase around the countryside, blowing up power lines and police stations, and still accumulate this vast cache of artifacts inside this temple. It's obvious you're running an elaborate artifact thief ring that has to be a full-time operation." Amaru looked at his prisoners in mocking speculation. "Since the fact must be patiently apparent to everyone in the room, I won't bother to deny it." A few seconds passed in silence. Then Doc Miller rose unsteadily to his feet, stared Amaru directly in the eye. "You thieving scum," he rasped. "Pillager, ravager of antiquities. If it was in my power, I'd have you and your band of looters shot down like—" Miller broke off suddenly as Amaru, his features utterly lacking the least display of emotion, and his black eyes venting evil, removed a Heckler & Koch 9mm automatic from a hip holster. With the paralyzing I'm going to start again. With the paralyzing inevitability of a dream, he calmly, precisely shot Doc Miller in the chest. The reverberating blast echoed through the temple, deafening all ears. One shot was all that was required. Doc Miller jerked backward against the stone fall for one shocking moment and then dropped forward onto his stomach without a sound. Hands and arms twisted oddly beneath his chest as a pool of red oozed across the floor. The captives all reflected different reactions. Rogers stood like a statue, frozen in time, eyes wide with shock and disbelief, while Shannon instinctively screamed. No stranger to death, Giordino clenched his hands at his side. The ice-cold indifference of the murderous act filled him with a savage rage that was tempered only by maddening helplessness. There was no doubt in his mind, in anybody's mind, that Amaru intended to kill them all. With nothing to lose, Giordino tensed to leap at the killer and tear out his throat before he received the inevitable bullet through the head. "Do not try," said Amaru, reading Giordino's thoughts, aiming the muzzle of the automatic weapon between the eyes that burned with hate. He inclined his head toward the guards, who stood with guns level and ready, and gave them orders in Spanish. Then he stepped aside as one of the guards grabbed Miller around the ankles and dragged his body out of sight into the main room of the temple, leaving a trail of blood across the stone floor. Shannon's scream had given way to uncontrollable sobbing as she stared with bleak, unwavering eyes at the bloody streak on the floor. She sagged to her knees in shock and buried her face in her hands. "He wouldn't have harmed you. How could you shoot down a kindly old man?" Giordino stared at Amaru. "For his kind, it's easy." Amaru's flat, cold eyes crawled to Giordino's face. "You would do well to keep your mouth closed, little man. The good doctor was supposed to be a lesson that apparently you did not understand." No one took notice of the return of the guard who had dragged away Miller's body. No one except Giordino. He caught that the hat was pulled down over the eyes and the hands concealed within the poncho. He flicked a glance at the second guard, who slouched casually against the doorway, his gun now slung loosely over one shoulder, the muzzle pointing at no one in particular. Only 2 feet separated them. Giordino figured he could be all over the guard before he knew what hit him, but there was still the heckler and coke tightly gripped in Amaru's hand. When Giordino spoke, his voice wore a cold edge. "You are going to die, Amaru. You are surely going to die as violently as all the innocent people you've murdered in cold blood." Amaru didn't catch the millimetric curl of Giordano's lips, the slight squint of his eyes. His expression turned curious, then the teeth flashed and he laughed. "So, you think I'm going to die, do you? Will you be my executioner, or will the proud young lady do me the honor?" And he leaned down and savagely jerked Shannon to her feet, took a hold of her flowing ponytail, and viciously pulled her hair backward until she was staring from wide, terrified eyes into his leering face. "I promise that after a few hours in my bed, you'll crawl to obey my commands." "Oh, no," Shannon moaned. A brawny arm tightened around his throat and choked off his words. "This is for all the women you have made suffer," said Pitt, a macabre look in his intense green eyes as he cast aside the poncho, jammed the barrel of the .45 Colt down the front of Amaru's shirt, and pulled the trigger. Well, Pitt comes to the rescue.